The steam locomotive, the most important revolution of 19th century technology. Well, okay, maybe after the light bulb, electric telegraph, typewriter, telephone, camera, automobile, chewing gum, Coca-Cola, you get the memo. Although steam power was retired in favor of diesel and electric engines by the mid-20th century, thousands of steam locomotives were thankfully preserved and spared the horrific fate of being cut up, melted down, and recycled into tin cans on your supermarket shelves. Many of these engines would be much more fortunate, as they would also be restored to operating condition and be given a second life. Today, hundreds of engines, whether currently operating or not, have experienced the glory of operating on tourist lines or even hauling mainline excursions, and thus bear the distinction of Steam Excursion Star. However, not every engine which experienced this glory is still around today. In America, some of these stars were destined for a brighter or even a quieter life in preservation. But through a series of unfortunate circumstances, they ended up suffering a fate they would ultimately have met anyway. I've never seen anyone do a video exclusively on this topic. In most cases, other YouTubers have included these engines in videos on retired stars, all of which are great videos. However, I've never believed deceased and retired to be the same subject matter, as indeed they are not. So today, on Halloween night, I present you all with something a little different. This is my personal list of the top 5 deceased Steam Excursion stars. Number 5. Union Pacific Challenger number 3967. Right out of the gate, we have a true pioneer in steam excursion history. This mighty 4664 articulated locomotive was one of 105 Challengers built by the American Locomotive Company for heavy freight and passenger trains on the Union Pacific. They worked alongside the railroad's legendary big boy locomotives, with the second group of 65 closely resembling them in appearance. 3967 was one of the second group of engines and left Schenectady, New York in 1942. She possessed a rather unique feature, as she was outfitted with smoke deflectors and was one of only a few UP Challengers to carry them. This thus made her ideal for passenger services, which she also saw some use on. The first several years of her career went by uneventfully until May 17, 1953, when she was assigned to pull a special excursion train from Denver, Colorado to Laramie, Wyoming via Sherman Hill, one of the railroad's most challenging gradients. The trip was sponsored by the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club and was the UP's first ever excursion. The mighty Challenger handled the task at hand with ease and would set the precedent for Union Pacific's future Heritage Excursion program. Following the excursion, 3967 resumed her career in revenue service until being withdrawn in 1957. She was broken up in 1960, leaving only 2 of her sibling Challengers to relish the joy of preservation. In 1993, however, some 30-odd years after her demise, 3967 would rise from the ashes in the form of her sister engine 3985. On May 17th, the 40th anniversary of the 53 trip, 3985 donned a pair of smoke deflectors and a replica number plate and honored her long-lost sister with a reenactment of the trip which made her famous all those years ago. Number 4. Norfolk and Western Y6B number 2174. This monstrous workhorse emerged from the N&W's own erecting shops in Roanoke, Virginia in 1948 and was one of 30 Y6B Class 2882 Malays. They were among the last steam engines constructed by the N&W and were hands down their largest and most powerful engines ever. 2174 was used, like the other Y6Bs, on heavy freight and coal trains up until the late 50s, when the Norfolk and Western finally began withdrawing their steam fleet. In In July 1959, she took part in the railway's Farewell to Steam excursion between Roanoke and Yeager, West Virginia. She did so along with A-class locomotive number 1240, which handled the train as far as Bluefield, West Virginia, before 2174 took over for the remainder of the trip to Yeager. The behemoth put on an incredible display, performing an epic photo run-by on a trestle bridge during the journey. Following the excursion and her subsequent retirement, 2174 languished in a Roanoke scrapyard along with another Malay until 1976. That year, after the original owner passed away, the yard's ownership was transferred to a British firm, and quite shockingly, they were not interested in saving the mighty American engines. Gee, I wonder if they were British rail diehards. An effort to purchase 2174 for preservation came up short, and after the deadline passed, the last of the Y6Bs, N&W's largest locomotives, was no more. Number 3. Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy number 5632. Described as one of the most handsome engines of the Burlington route, 5632 was one of the railroad's 3605 series of 484 Northerns, of which 4 are still around today. Built in August 1940 by the company's own workshops in Burlington, Iowa, she spent her career hauling fast freight and passenger trains all over the CB&Q's network. At some point, the engine was converted from coal to oil firing and was redesignated as an 05B. After her withdrawal from revenue service in the late 50s, 5632 was refurbished in late 1958 for use in the railroad's own steam excursion program. The following year, she took part in a double-header from Chicago to Galesburg, Illinois, along with number 6315, one of the company's 210-4s. During the run, 6315 suffered a failure, and 5632 continued on to Galesburg with the excursion, while also shoving the larger engine ahead of her. She ran in excursion service until 1964. During that year, she was painted in a special gold livery to celebrate 100 years of CB&Q service into Chicago, as well as 50 years since the completion of Kansas City's Union Station. She affectionately became known as the world's largest brass model as a result. After a change in leadership, the Burlington steam program was shut down in '65, and 5632 was sold to steam preservationist Richard Jensen, who transferred her to a Chicago roundhouse for storage. However, in 1969, Jensen was suddenly evicted by the owner of the roundhouse, the Chicago and Western Indiana Railroad, with only a short notice. They refused to allow him to inspect the engine, which the bastard company illegally sold to a local scrapyard. Fate was not on her side, as 5632 would derail while traversing a switch within the yard, and without a logical method to derail her, the decision was made. The once proud Northern was tragically sentenced to the scrapper's cutting torch, and the engine ceased to exist by 1972. Number 2. Grand Trunk Western number 5629. Built by Alco in February 1924, this attractive Pacific was one of 8 such K4 class 462s constructed for passenger service on the GTW. A similar engine of this type, number 5632, ironically, still exists today. After a long service life with the company, including excursions courtesy of the railroad itself, 5629 was retired and placed into storage in 1959. She was sold to Richard Jensen in 1960 and was restored for further excursion service beginning the following year. Throughout the 60s, 5629 became a highly popular excursion star, running numerous excursions yearly, even getting to haul the Schlitz circus train between Baraboo and Milwaukee, Wisconsin in '67 and '68. During this period, Jensen also owned the aforementioned CB&Q 5632, as well as two other Burlington engines, 282 Mikados numbers 4963 and 4960, both of which are still around. Around 1973, Jensen injured his back in a freak accident, and 5629 was stored on an Amtrak siding at Chicago's Union Station while he recovered. In the late 70s, he had the locomotive transferred to the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad's freight yard in Blue Island, Illinois. Jensen's accident had financially crippled him, and he could not afford to run more excursions with 5629. However, this would quickly become the least of his problems. By 1980, the Rock Island had declared bankruptcy, and its assets were being liquidated. This included the yard that 5629 rested in, which was acquired by everyone's most loathed commuter railroad, Metra. The railroad ordered Jensen to relocate the engine to the nearby Iowa Interstate Railroad so they could repurpose the yard. However, they refused to provide assistance in moving her and wouldn't even allow Jensen to inspect her for such a transfer. Unfortunately, the engine had fallen victim to vandalism and was in such a state that moving her was a huge risk. Jensen, with his health failing, filed a restraining order against Metra and took them to court. The court ruled that Metra could not touch 5629 since she was owned by Jensen. However, they also ruled that if he couldn't move the engine, Metra had permission to dispose of her. Knowing the inevitable was on the horizon, Jensen had several parts, including the bell and headlight, removed and sold off for safekeeping. The Illinois Railway Museum and the Mid-Continent Railway Museum, along with other groups, attempted to voluntarily save 5629, but were unsuccessful. Finally, Metra, now sick of waiting, took matters into their own hands. On July 14, 1987, the vile scum who claimed to be a friendly commuter railroad sent out a salvage team and over the next several days savagely, maliciously, and mercilessly sliced the venerable Pacific into oblivion. Rail fans who had attempted to save the engine were completely and utterly horrified by what they witnessed. The revolting scene looked like the mangled carcass of a slaughtered animal. It was almost too awful to bear. To make this act of sacrilege even more damning, it was later discovered that several of Metra's own employees had contributed to the prior vandalism of the engine. Richard Jensen would sue Metra for the loss of 5629, just as he had done successfully with 5632's lost years earlier. This time around, though, the court ruled against him, and he received no damages from Metra. The only positive of this story is that the vandalous employees found to be responsible were subsequently and rightfully fired from the company. Jensen would later pass away in 1991. The tragedy of 5629, the unnecessary demise of a preserved steam engine, is the reason that Metra shall only get their hands on my money when they pry it out of my cold, lifeless fists. I would much rather walk through the Chicago suburbs during a downpour of golf ball-sized hail than ride one of their trains. I really have nothing more to say here other than, Metra, may thou burn forevermore in the deepest, darkest, fiery depths of hell. Before I reveal the number one pick, I would like to include an honorable mention. Initially, I hadn't planned to include one for this video. However, once I learned about this locomotive, I knew right away that I had to give her a segment. Either way, I give you Baltimore and Ohio EM1 number 7600. Here's an engine I've never heard anyone talk about before. The first of 30 2884 Yellowstones manufactured for America's first railroad, 7600 left Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1944. She and her sisters were some of the most modern and classy designs of articulated engines created, as they were built with all of the latest technology. They quickly became the B&O's flagship locomotives, proving their versatility on freight and coal trains as well as fast mail and express services. After a passenger train derailment in early 1947, the EM1s would be restrained to running only freight and coal trains along the Cumberland and Pittsburgh divisions for the remainder of their careers, with a notable exception. In the mid-1950s, the Baltimore and Ohio operated several railfan trips running between Cumberland, Maryland and Connellsville, Pennsylvania, with the railroad choosing 7600 to head them. After the trips, the Yellowstone continued on with freight duties until the end of the decade, when the EM1s were all withdrawn from the B&O roster and broken up. She was gone by the early 60s. However, the story doesn't quite end there. I couldn't confirm this part for certain, so bear with me here. Allegedly, the engine was destined for the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. This wasn't to be, however, thanks to a miscommunication on behalf of a short-sighted and short-witted yardmaster who mistook the reason for the engine's upcoming transfer and ordered that she be taken to the scrapyard. By the time B&O management learned about the museum plans and the communication error, 7600 was already gone. The yardmaster responsible for the mix-up was reportedly sacked for his incompetence. As many people know, sister engine 7609 nearly made it into preservation, but came up just short for similar reasons, so it really stings that an EM1 had not one but two potential chances at survival, only to barely slip the net both times. Talk about close but no cigar. Now I know there are other steam excursion stars such as Illinois Central number 2613 that are also deceased. However, we'd be here all day trying to name them all, so please feel free to mention any deceased steam stars you know of down in the comments section. Perhaps someone knows of others that haven't been mentioned yet. Number 1. Southern Pacific Cab Forward number 4274. If there was one type of steam engine in America that always fascinated me, it was the Southern Pacific's legendary AC series of cab forwards. These unusual locomotives were designed for service through the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California, particularly the treacherous Donner Pass. For years, the SP had faced difficulties with this route. The high number of tunnels and snow sheds along the line caused serious respiratory problems for the crews of conventional engines. In the early 20th century, Baldwin of Eddystone, Pennsylvania came up with a solution. They manufactured a series of unique engines with the smokebox, boiler, and cab all reversed on the frame. The smokebox now permanently faced the tender, and the modified enclosed cab became the front of the locomotives. The engines burned oil, as coal firing would be impossible under this arrangement. The new cab forwards, as they were called, became an instant success. Engine crews now had an unobstructed view of the line, and they were no longer at risk of asphyxiation when going through tunnels. The Southern Pacific and Baldwin continued refining the design until the early 40s, with their efforts culminating in the SP's AC-10, AC-11, and AC-12 482s. 4274 was the last of 30 AC-11s on the railroad's roster. Outshopped in 1943, she served the SP on freight and passenger assignments until 1956, when she was retired and placed into storage. The following year, however, an organization of railroad enthusiasts banded together to request one final run with the iconic cab forward. Southern Pacific agreed and selected 4274 to pull the special train. She was the most ideal pick for the job, as she'd undergone repairs earlier that January and was thus in the best condition. She was removed from storage and quickly prepared for the two-day trip. On November 30th, 1957, after a shakedown in Roseville, California a few days prior, the AC-11 departed Sacramento, California for Reno, Nevada with the 10-car Excursion. The train, Extra 4274, traversed Donner Pass along the way, and the engine put on a fantastic final effort as she tackled her old stomping grounds for which she was built for one final time. To the delight of everyone who witnessed the event, the cold, crisp weather that weekend made for excellent photographs, which everyone took full advantage of. The locomotive returned to Sacramento the next day at the head of train number 27, the Overland, and and after the run had concluded, 4274's fire was dropped for the final time. She was put back into storage, and 2 years later, she disappeared from history altogether. Fellow engine AC-12 number 4294, the final cab forward, survives today at the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento and is the sole survivor of over 250 Southern Pacific cab forwards. From what I understand, 4274 was supposedly intended to be preserved at the CSRM. However, she was long gone by the time they set out searching for her, and they were fortunate to get 4294 instead. While it's gratifying to have her around, keeping a significant chapter of railroading history alive, it feels there will always be a void that just cannot be filled. It is due to her origin and unique design, my personal fascination with engines such as her, the deserving of a fate far better than was given to her, and the fact that her final run truly was the closing chapter of a historic era of railroading, that Southern Pacific 4274 is number one on my list of deceased steam excursion stars.